Stephen, let's just talk about the policy implications. The BOJ finds itself in a really difficult place right now. Inflation is rising in Japan. We're waiting to find out whether it's going to stick with current policy that had its bedrock in Abenomics. How does this change that policy framework that the BOJ is going to be operating under?
Well, really, the question you're getting at is where do we go in terms of yield curve control? Because that is the central component that is most questioned about the particular position we're in with Kuroda running the BOJ and what that will do to the currency if that policy is changed. Clearly, the Prime Minister was a very, very big supporter of BOJ Governor Kuroda, and it remains to be seen whether or not his power base gets weakened in this environment. If his power base does get weakened, then the support behind the whole yield curve control dialogue, which is one of the reasons why the yen has been weakening and the equity market has been holding up better than other equity markets around the world, is a critical linchpin. Because if we wind up seeing a reversal in the yield curve control environment, the yen could start to strengthen. If the yen started to strengthen again, you'd add additional downward pressure in terms of Japanese stocks as we go forward here. So it really comes down to the support block behind the BOJ governor. He is due to step down, I believe, in February of next year. I don't think anything will happen between now and then. But as things always unfold in Japan, they unfold slowly and in the backdrop, trying to build a consensus. We'll get some feeling as to where that consensus is going, and then we'll get a better feel and it'll start to be reflected very, very quickly in terms of the currency story.
Stephen, I'm glad you brought up the yield curve control story, and especially that yen potential for yen strength. But I'm curious, what are the actual odds of that? I mean, I believe we have an election in Japan as soon as this weekend, in addition to a BOJ that has really stood steadfast in that policy. So what are the odds of that scenario that you just outlined?
Well, that really is the critical question, and I am 100% in agreement with your point that, you know, when you look at where yield curve control is at the center of the situation, unfortunately, I think eliminating yield curve control does one thing: it helps banks. But does it really help the rest of the Japanese economy to allow long-term real yields to widen and perhaps the curve to steepen a bit? Maybe it helps out a little bit in terms of retiree savings, but really not all that much. So it's a real question as to how much that will have an impact on the underlying macroeconomic story, but it will have a big impact on what happens in terms of the currency, and that's why it's the focus that everyone has. I put the probabilities on it as, 25%.
Okay, but a significant tail risk. Order of magnitude of a move that you could see were that to happen?
Order of magnitude in the currency? Order of magnitude in the equity. Well, in the currency, I think you could probably have a 5 to 10% correction very, very quickly in the yen.
5 to 10% correction in the yen. Let's talk about the other, perhaps, policy implications for the BOJ here, known as very experimental and very in the forefront of global monetary policy. Let's talk about the ETF story as well, because the BOJ, I think, was probably one of the first central banks, I believe, to start buying ETFs. Any effect on that kind of policy?
Again, I think that's all secondary to the yield curve control story, because the two new members coming into the BOJ Board of Governors are really much more anti the yield curve control. Clearly, the purchasing program has been an important component of the Abenomics story, but that's secondary. We have to deal with the yield curve control piece first before we get into the secondary question. And I think when you're looking at the Japanese economy, the demographic factors that they're still confronting, I think it's going to be very hard for whatever they do to have a real significant macroeconomic impact.
Stephen, talk to us a little bit about the stability here. That was one of his legacies, that after a period where Japan had seen prime minister after prime minister, the lost decade even, that Abe really represented this period of stability and was still an influential force when it came to Japanese politics. His passing, what does that mean for Japan broadly? And I would say for the world broadly, now that we don't have that stabilizing force.
Well, we certainly hope it doesn't lead back to the pattern that we had seen before of prime ministers coming and going on a very, very regular basis. Clearly, he did lend some stability to the political environment. But again, he did it by leading from ideas. He did it by leaving from proposals to try to correct the problems. And I think when you're looking at the current administration in Japan, there has to be a bit more stepping up on their side in terms of where they're going to go, how they're going to go, and how they're going to make or affect change in the Japanese economy against the myriad of problems that they confront. And I think that's really going to be the telltale sign. If they don't do that, we could go back to the volatility. If they do step up, then I think you could be in an environment where you can have return stability being maintained.